Good morning. Today we said we have one of those great events where we celebrate the life, the work, and so forth of somebody that has done something extraordinary for our Department of Surgery, and that is Dr. Davidheimbach. This was made possible by Nicole and her family, who about 13 years ago decided to fund an event that would be then permanent in the Department of Surgery by an endowment called the Davidheimbach Lecture. Dr. Heimbach was a surgeon that came to the University of Washington in the early 60s, or actually in the early 70s, sorry, 72, with a group of surgeons that came from Texas, and that's a story that sometimes you may want to read because it had a lot to do with the development of our department. Suffice it to say that he was working here at the University of Washington Medical Center, particularly interested in endocrine surgery and reoperative type of surgery, GI as well as endocrine, when he was called upon by his chair to go to Harborview and really start, develop, and make what the Burn Center is today. And he has mentored a lot of people over his years in the Burn Center, including Nicole. And so I would ask to have Nicole come forward and introduce today the lecture for the Heimbach Lecture, which is the number 12 Heimbach Lecture. Nicole?
Thank you, Dr. Pellegrini. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce a very, very special guest. Dr. David Auth trained and received his PhD in electrical engineering and physics from Georgetown. He and his wife Nancy are here. They are very special guests because actually they have been long friends of the Burn Center. Not only have they collaborated in the early days to test a laser scalpel, which Dr. Auth invented and which he published with Dr. Heimbach in 1980, a description of how it could be used to excise burns. But he also collaborated with Dr. Carrico, our past chair, to see how it could be used to coagulate solid organs that were bleeding. Later, he re-entered our world when he met Matt Klein and was interested in long-term outcomes of burns, and Matt talked about our long history of being focused on functional and psychological outcomes after injury, and he funded an endowment to support Matt Klein's research and our collective Burn Center research. And when Matt left, I was very privileged to be the second holder of that chair. Dr. Auth has had numerous inventions that he has come up with, that he has taken through testing, and then he has commercialized. And for that reason, I was interested to hear, how does somebody do that? Not once, but many, many times. And I asked him whether or not he would come and share this story with us today. I will say that for the Burn Center, he's been part of an urban legend forever, because from the time that I was the Burn Fellow in 1990, I would hear about Mr. Pig, who would be added on to the schedule at the end of the day, and he had to be scheduled. But Mr. Pig would roll in after the rest of the patients had been operated on, and they would test the laser scalpel on a porcine friend. And so, Dr. Auth, thank you very much for joining us. We're delighted to have you, and welcome to Grand Rounds. Oh, I never showed my second picture. I'm sorry. There's my second picture.
That was up. Well, thank you, Dr. Gibran, and all I appreciate all of you attending this morning. I hope I can make it interesting for you. Professor Gibran asked me where my thumb drive was from my talk this morning, and I said I don't have one. And I hope that the absence of a PowerPoint presentation won't be disappointing for you. I did teach engineering here at the university for 13 years, from 1969 until 1982. And during that time, I found myself developing an interest in bioengineering. When I came in '69, I was really hired to be a person to build out the electro-optics program in the Department of Electrical Engineering. And by the way, can you hear me okay in the back? It's all clear? So I did that, and my PhD was actually in laser physics, so I had a very deep sense of laser technology at that point in time. That was only roughly 10 years after the laser had been invented. And it was an exciting time for those of us in the field of physical optics and whatnot. And so I began this program in EE and ticked along for a while, but there was always this buzz around campus about this thing called bioengineering. And it had a certain glamour about it. You know, it was all brand new. And it turned out that the first center for bioengineering was right here at the University of Washington. It was founded by Dr. Bob Rushmer. And Bob Rushmer was actually an MD, but he was a person that had a very deep-seated interest in the notion of engineering being able to work with medicine to have an end result that was greater than the sum of the parts. And so I always heard, you know, this bioengineering buzz going around campus, but I didn't get too involved with it for the most part. But in 1972, Bob Rushmer called me on the phone, and it was sort of like, well, you're David Auth, electrical engineering, and you're an optics guy, and we got this guy over in gastroenterology whose name is Cyrus Reuben. And he's kind of a crotchety guy, so don't let him throw you off. But he's chairing this national committee for the National Institutes of Health, and he has all these big shot doctors from all over the world that are on this committee. You know, chairman of this department and chairman of that department, and famous for this and famous for that. But you know, I met with him, and I found out he has nobody on his committee that knows anything about optics, and yet this committee's charter is to figure out ways of expanding the usefulness of this new tool they have. And that new tool is the fiber optic endoscope. The fiber optic endoscope became possible because people learned how to arrange 10,000 or 100,000 optical fibers in such an array that they could transport faithfully an image from one place to another. And because they're fiber optic, they're flexible, and therefore you can make an endoscope go down the stomach or into the colon or whatever. And so, you know, it seems to me they need to have somebody with a little technical background on this committee, and I'm going to suggest that you go over and talk to Dr. Reuben and see if you might be able to fit on his committee. And I thought, well, I'm a young assistant professor. Dr. Rushmer's a big shot on campus. I probably ought to do this thing, and I'll go talk to him. So I talked to his secretary. Her name was Terry Helton. Imagine that. Still remember that after all these years. Terry was kind of sized defensive guard. You know, you had to kind of pass through the gates of Terry before you got to Cyrus Reuben. So I set up an appointment and all the proper protocol and everything, and I went over to one particular day in 1972, and I checked in with Terry. And she knew we had an appointment, so I finally get ushered into his inner sanctum, which was an office with no windows, and you know, it was like almost like a closet, you know, behind Terry's desk, and he's hunched over a microscope. It turned out that Cyrus Reuben was also a pathologist. In fact, much of his great work in gastroenterology was because he had a good understanding of pathology. He would examine his own slides and the whole business. So I walk into his inner sanctum, and he's hunched over this microscope, and he doesn't even look up at me. He doesn't, much less shake my hand. He doesn't even look up at me. And then finally, he's kind of looking through the microscope, obviously very preoccupied with what he's doing. He says, well, who are you? Well, I said, I'm David Auth. I'm a professor in electrical engineering, and I'm here because Dr. Rushmer thought that you would like to maybe consider having me join your committee. Oh, okay. Well, tell me a little bit about yourself. So I began to rattle off, some of my accomplishments and one thing and the other. I'm a professor in electrical engineering, and I work in lasers and optics and blah 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 blah. And incidentally, my PhD is not actually in electrical engineering; it's in physics. And all of a sudden, he raises up his head and he's like, "Oh, I'm so relieved." Because I think engineers are so boring, don't you? So here was this Harvard-trained MD, with all of the afflictions of thinking that engineers are glorified train operators. But physicists, now you're talking about people with really intellect, and maybe it's okay if I talk to you. So that was our first encounter, an incredibly memorable moment that I will never forget. So anyway, we started chatting, and I was in due course put on his committee and began to meet some of the other members of the committee and travel around the country for their as they were trying to figure out what to do that would expand the usefulness of the endoscope. About the only thing that they could do that was therapeutic was actually do what was called a polypectomy. Many of you probably know about that, where they'd take a radio frequency activated wire and slice through a polyp in the colon and then extract it. So that was pretty cool. And of course, they could use the endoscope for doing biopsies, and that was cool. But Sai actually had a lot of disdain for the average endoscopist because he felt that they were just people who liked this little widget that they could throw down somebody's stomach and look around, have a look-see. And he used to refer to them as the boob at the end of the tube, because he felt they didn't really have much understanding of the underlying disease that was going on. They could just look at it. Nonetheless, we went about our business, and sooner or later I asked Sai, what is his most urgent need now as a gastroenterologist and you have this new instrument, the endoscope. What's your most urgent need? And he says, well, the problem we really have that's really a big deal is we can sit there with the endoscope and watch a bleeding ulcer spurting spurting blood, and we really don't have any way to stop that. And if it doesn't somehow stop on its own with whatever kind of pills we can put down their stomach, they'll have to go to surgery. And I'm like, well, that's pretty interesting, because about 10 years earlier I had a bleeding ulcer as a senior in college, and I had to go to surgery too. They couldn't stop my bleeding either. So I thought this is an amazing piece of serendipity. This is his urgent need, and I'd already been down that rat hole 10 years earlier. And I said, well, I think I might be able to help you with this. And I'd been aware, sort of in passing, I'd read an article that was published by a guy named Goodale at the University of Minnesota, who had used a carbon dioxide laser operating in the middle infrared at 10.6 microns, which is a wavelength that doesn't really like to go through anything flexible. So he just ran it down a hollow tube into a dog's stomach, and it was able to cauterize some mild bleeding in a dog. And it didn't really go anyplace. It was kind of one of those little blurbs that you see in a minor headline someplace. And so I went back and looked into that, the work that he had done, and blah blah blah. But of course, we wanted something flexible. So carbon dioxide laser running at that middle infrared wavelength was not going to be available in a convenient, flexible modality. I was also aware that just about 6 months earlier, there had been a big announcement by Bell Labs and Corning Glassworks in New York about the fact that they had just developed a quartz fiber that was able to transmit a laser beam over distances of miles. And it was considered an enormous breakthrough, because it meant that now the idea of being able to actually put messages on a laser beam and send it down a fiber optic cable was possible. It wouldn't be so lossy that you had to have repeater stations every half a meter, so you could actually go miles with this thing. And so what that also meant was that you could actually put a lot of power down that same flexible fiber without having so much heat loss from the laser that it would actually melt the fiber. And that was good too, because that meant that we could potentially use it as an endoscope that would deliver enough power to actually cauterize a bleeding vessel without melting the fiber. So I called up one of the people at Corning Glassworks, and in Corning, New York, of course, And I said, hey, I'm a professor at the University of Washington, and I'd like to try using this fiber with a high-powered laser to cauterize bleeding. Oh, well, we don't want to get involved in any medical stuff. We're a glass company. We don't want any medical liability. And I pleaded with the guy and over the course of time, he said, well, I'll sell you, I think it was 100 meters of fiber for $1,000. Okay. So I go to Bob Rushford and I said, I need $1,000. And Bob says, fine, you got $1,000. So I bought the fiber. And then I had to get a big laser. And so Cy and I together traveled down to California and began talking to the ranking laser companies of the era. And of course, they were in none other than Silicon Valley, big surprise. And we met with some of the laser folks down there, and really the biggest laser company was a company called Spectra Physics, and we presented this concept to them. And they're like, it's kind of like, we got more darn doctors in here trying to convince us to use a laser for something. I don't think we don't want to really monkey around with this. But we presented it to Coherent Laser Company, and they had become very active in using, they had developed a commercial product using a laser to do coagulation of the retina. And it was an argon laser. And so they already had an interest in the medical aspects of lasers. And they said, well, I think we can send you, we will loan you a laser. But you will have to share with us any of your research results in case we want to use that commercially. So sure enough, we got a high-powered argon laser up to Seattle. We got the fiber from Corning. I had a couple of graduate students figure out how to put that laser beam down that flexible fiber. We had to have all the insertion optics, and then we had to adapt it to an endoscope so that it wouldn't blind the endoscopist while he was using it, because if you looked at that laser flash through the endoscope when it was turned on to coagulate, it was extremely bright. So we arranged a very elaborate shuttering system that would not allow the laser to fire until it was in place in front of the endoscopist's eyes. We did all that stuff. And then along the way we figured, well, we have to really develop, and this is where the engineers have to rely on the medical side of things. We have to develop a bleeding ulcer model that will mean something. And of course, Cy was the guy who, in the early 1960s, had developed the suction biopsy capsule. And so they could blindly insert this capsule down somebody's esophagus into their stomach and into the intestines. And they couldn't see actively, but they could use an X-ray machine to find out where that little gizmo was going. And it actually had a little tube about 1 centimeter in diameter that you could draw a vacuum on a little hole, so you could kind of pooch up the mucosa and go like that, and then there was a knife that would come across like that and cleave off a specimen of the tissue. And it had a chamber behind it that would collect these little discs of tissue, and so you could get down there and snip, 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 and wind up getting lots of biopsy samples in the GI system, and then pull the tube out and examine these tissue specimens. Well, so that he worked with Wayne Quentin to develop that suction biopsy capsule. And of course, Wayne Quentin is the guy that made history because he did a lot of the early treadmill work with who are the two famous guys that did the treadmill in cardiology?
One was Stranded, the other one.
No, it wasn't not Stranded. No, it was. Huh?
Werner Sampson.
What was it?
Werner Sampson.
No, that's not right. I'm blanking on the names. You would recognize them right away if I could remember. But anyway, so Wayne Quentin, and they founded Quentin Instrument Company, which of course many of you probably know about, make the treadmills for doing exercise physiology testing. And then eventually Wayne got involved with the shunts for kidney dialysis, worked with Belden Scribner and the whole bunch. So we had this suction biopsy capsule that was adapted then now for an ulcer model in dogs. And we would open up, we had the vivarium here with a 60,000 square foot vivarium. Again, the engineers had to rely on having all of this medical machinery to work with. And we located a veterinary surgeon named Mel Dennis, who was a wonderful guy. And Cy used to say that he was such a good surgeon, he'd rather have him operating on than the average surgeon running around that's working on people. No offense, okay. So worked out this model. We'd laparoscopize, open up the dog's belly, and then we'd cut open the stomach and fillet it out. And then we put the suction biopsy capsule down there on the stomach and suck it up and sniff it off, and sure enough, we'd have an injury right down the muscularis mucosa, and we'd have oodles and oodles and oodles of bleeding. And now we had to figure out how we were going to stop it. And then because dogs had such an intrinsic coagulation response, because they're used to swallowing sharp bones and things, we had to heparinize the dog to make sure that what we were doing was stopping the bleeding and not the dog's intrinsic clotting factors working in his favor. So we heparinized the dog, we had a spurting artery, and we began testing this argon laser modality. And we'd shoot this beam at high power at the bleeding vessel, and most of the time it wouldn't stop. And what was happening was that this effusion of blood coming out of the ulcer was providing its own ablation shield, kind of like the shuttle coming into the atmosphere. It was ablating away, but the underlying surface wasn't getting touched. And so, okay, that means we got to get rid of the blood. So then I had a bunch of graduate students working on gas jet assisted laser, which meant we were blowing the blood away. But then we had to evacuate the air that was being used to blow the blood away, and that became a big recycling system. I think that was the subject of somebody's master's thesis or something. But the whole thing was getting to be really clunky, and clunky is not good whenever you're doing anything in medical devices. You want something simple, straightforward, easy to use, works every time, doesn't ever cause any problem, blah, blah, blah. So along the way, Cy says to me, he says, I seem to recall that back in olden times, when you had a soldier wounded on the battlefield, they just take a branding iron and slap it on there and coagulate the bleeding. They'd smash it on and sizzle a little bit, and the bleeding would stop. Why don't you just do something like that? Forget about all this laser stuff. And so I thought, well, okay, we'll test that. So I went back to electrical engineering and worked with one of my technicians named Frem Cheroux. And I said, Frem, I want to cut out a little section of a Teflon frying pan, about 1 centimeter in diameter, and I want to screw it on the end of a temperature-controlled soldering iron, and then we're going to take that back to the dog lab, and we're going to see what happens. So we took that thing back to the dog lab, and of course this was not totally non-endoscopic. This is open surgery, smash it on. All right, so we got a big old nice bloody ulcer with the ulcer model. By the way, the ulcer model became a subject of quite a bit of interest in the GI media at the time. And took that thing, first time, thing sitting there, blood pouring out, take it, stopped. Oh boy, look at that. So then we knew right away that we had to develop something that was endoscopically passable. So it had to be something about 2.5 millimeters in diameter that would do the same thing, but it couldn't be something that would simply, that the gastroenterologist would just simply put on for a while and pull off. It had to be something that was quantitative, that would put pressure on the vessel to actually cause a coaptation of the vessel, to squeeze the vessel walls together, and it had to apply heat, but you couldn't have it apply heat for very long because otherwise it would cause a full thickness injury of the gastric wall. And the gastric wall and the dogs we were working on were typically about 4 millimeters thick. So I began thinking, I thought, well, we can make a catheter with a hot tip that will duplicate what we did with that Teflon coated frying pan and the soldering iron, but it has to be such that it can be put on and get up to temperature very quickly and come down to temperature very quickly, so that we cause just a shallow burn about 2 millimeters deep in the stomach wall and not go full thickness. So we need to have this thing turn on and off in about a second. So it's kind of like, when you do you sear your tuna for your tuna salad or whatever, you want a very thin layer of coagulation. So I applied for an NIH grant, actually NIGMS, got a grant to develop this catheter that would do a very short pulse of thermal energy and coagulate bleeding. I got the grant, And we began developing a device that basically had a kind of a microcircuit resistor inside that we could zap it with a lot of electrical energy. It would come up to temperature right away, and you could put it on the tissue, hit the button, and it would send out so many joules of energy. And we had a knob in the front where you could adjust the energy. But the dang thing kept fizzling out. It would just burn itself up. It was just too finicky. I had a graduate student that was, I think, being supported by that same NIH grant. And this now brings in the whole importance of having grant support, money support, blah, 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 to do these things. Because unless you got that, you just don't have people that are engaged and working on this thing on a essentially full-time basis. That graduate student's name was Tim Mayhew. I remember Tim very well because Tim and I both had an interest in cars. And Tim had a hopped up, I think it was an SS 396 Chevelle car, and he worked on it himself and everything. And over the years, I've come to appreciate any engineer that works on cars. Well, back then you could work on cars. Today it's another story. But it always kind of resonated with me because I knew this was a hands-on person that could get his fingers dirty and really understood materials and things, you know, in addition to all this high-powered differential equations that electrical engineers are known for. And put Tim to work on this thing to develop this little, this high-powered fast pulse resistor that would get the energy in and out very quickly. And along the way, Tim did a little bit of his own thinking, and he recognized that he could potentially use a thing called an avalanche diode. Now, an avalanche diode is a semiconductor device. It's a two-electrode device, so it's a diode. But it has a very interesting temperature and voltage curve. In other words, at some particular voltage, it will suddenly break down and let a lot of current through. So it goes up to a certain point, and all of a sudden, not much is getting through, and you get to a certain threshold voltage, and then all of a sudden, everything gets through. That's why it's called an avalanche diode, so that you suddenly burst. The other thing that Tim knew about was that this thing had the avalanche voltage point was temperature dependent. And the other thing Tim knew was that because it was a silicon-based device and was a high-powered diode, it could dissipate a lot of heat. And because it was a semiconductor, it could do this whole thing. It could go up and down very quickly. It could boom, as much as you want. And of course, now diode technology, LEDs and everything have revolutionized so many areas of our lives. But anyway, so he realized that you could put, you could set the temperature that you wanted just by adjusting the voltage. So if you wanted, for example, 160 degrees centigrade, which is what we had determined with the soldering iron, was the temperature we wanted to get the right heat transfer characteristics, the right coagulation profile, the right depth of injury, da-da-da-da-da-da. You could set that voltage, get the temperature you wanted, and it would freeze the temperature at that point, and as soon as you shut the thing off, heat would stop being dissipated and you were done. So it had the great combination of temperature control, high power dissipation, small size, and low thermal mass. We had to have low thermal mass, otherwise the heat would just sit there and cook and cook and cook. The whole thing had to come up to temperature and down again very quickly, so you give it a real short spurt of energy and get the job done. Well, that was like, and then he became one of the principal inventors of that technology through the university, patented through the university. That's a whole other story which I'm going to talk about. And eventually we started, we were doing all of this testing in dogs, and the thing was like bulletproof. You'd set the joules, you'd put it on, massively spurting artery, done, perfect. So then I started wondering about, you know, how we're going to get this thing from the laboratory to a commercial product. And well, backing up a second, I tried to get the thing patented through the university. And at that time, this was like roughly mid-late 70s. The university didn't have all the elaborate structure we got today with patents and intellectual property. They would send any invention disclosure from a professor, they would send this off to a company called Research Corporation in New York, which was kind of a patent licensing and whatnot firm. They would patent the technology if they liked it, and then the university would get some of the proceeds. But the university didn't have to spend any money because Research Corporation would put all the upfront money for the patent lawyers and all the rest of it. So they sent this invention disclosure that I wrote up for it off to Research Corporation New York, and in due course, the Research Corporation came back and says, we don't really think this has much commercial promise, and so we don't want to develop it. So then I get a call, I won't tell you the guy's name, but I get a call from the guy that was then the patent administrator for the university, and he says, well, Research Corporation's not going to patent it, so we're not going to do anything with this. Well, I knew we had a gangbusters product here. This thing would stop massive bleeding, would absolutely go through the endoscope. It was what we like to say in engineering terms, doctor-proof. You just push a button and it works, it goes, you know. And they don't want to patent this thing. And I'm like, well, you crazy. And so I call up the guy who was running that little rinky-dink office over the administration building. I said, well, if you guys aren't going to patent this thing, I'm going to patent it myself. And he's like, wait, you're going to patent it yourself? It's like, that costs money, you know, and you're just a professor and you don't have any money. So I said, yeah, I'm going to patent it myself. Oh, well, if you're going to patent it yourself, we'll patent it. So they did. And that went on to become one of the biggest royalty-producing inventions the university ever had. How do you like that? So sometimes you got to step out of the box as a professor and become an entrepreneur and really push all the buttons, because otherwise it's not going to get done. So then, now we're getting a patent, and I'm like, well, I'd like to start some clinical trials with things. I'm going to need to get this thing approved by the FDA. So I started reading the instruction sheet for how you do a product approval from the FDA. And that was back in the early days when they didn't have this tremendous bureaucracy of the FDA doing medical devices. It was relatively straightforward. I actually met with a guy from the FDA that happened to be a medical doctor, and I could explain all this technology to him. And sure enough, I got an FDA approval for this product. And we began, and then about the same time, I got to figure out how I'm going to start manufacturing this thing for clinical trials and whatnot. And it turned out that was about 1982, and I was in the process of negotiating with Squibb Corporation, who at that time owned Advanced Technology Labs, the big ultrasound company that was the predecessor of what's going on at Philips and everything. And so I was going to leave the university for a while and work on another invention I had in cardiology. And I managed to talk Squibb into buying what came to become popularly known as the heater probe, which I hated. It was a fast pulse thermal cautery probe. It's not just some heater probe, you know. There's a lot of elegant technology here. I mean, anybody can make a heater probe, but this is, you know, it's got all those parameters that we'd like to have: flexibility, fast pulse, precise temperature, low thermal heat, low thermal inertia, and on and on and on. But anyway, it became known as a heater probe. And so we licensed that to Squibb Corporation. University licensed it, did all the necessary paperwork for royalties and all this gobby. And then we continued to support, through Squibb Corporation, one way or the other, we began to do clinical trials and had this, and fortunately there was a guy named Dennis Jensen who was was a professor of gastroenterology at UCLA, and was a former graduate of the medical school at the University of Washington. He became very enamored of this product, and he wanted to do a multi-center clinical trial, and he wanted me to supply devices to all the centers so that they could use it. And so we did. And then smashing results. I mean, this multi-center trial showed this thing to be just the greatest thing you ever saw. And along the way, I had another guy who was a surgeon at Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney, Australia, who got wind of this thing, and he approached me and he said, I would like to use this device on patients that are on their way to the operating room for a bleeding ulcer, and I'm a surgeon, but I do endoscopy. I would like to use this device on those patients that are on their way to the operating room, and if we can get in there and intervene and stop the bleeding, they won't be operated on. But I'd like to use it in that setting. So I sent him a whole bunch of probes and the control console and everything else, and he started a clinical trial, a single center clinical trial. He got smashing results. Saved these people right and left from going to surgery, and so this was not some contrived thing. This was a real deal. So the combination of Dean Jensen's multi-center U.S. clinical trial and David Story's trial in Australia, this thing started to look interesting to a lot of people. And of course, Psi had such a big presence in gastroenterology that the whole world knew about it pretty much. But I still couldn't find anybody other than Squibb to commercialize this thing. But Squibb really didn't have a lot of, they were kind of doing it as a favor to me to even take this thing on. And I ran it out of my group at Squibb. But I was having trouble. I think we tried to get Fuji Corporation, who was involved with endoscopy, to license it. No interest. And things just kind of puttered along. I wasn't getting much traction on actually getting somebody to take this thing on as a commercial product, as good as it was. Now, this talk is titled Two Case Histories. Now I'm going to go to case 2, and I'm going to show how it influenced case 1. So, I'm at a big international conference on lasers in surgery and medicine in Detroit in 1979. I had to go back and check the date, actually. And this guy named Reinhold Wappler, who was the CEO of American Cystoscope Makers Incorporated, which was one of the big players in that day, later got sold to American Hospital Supply. I presented this heater probe at this laser conference. That's kind of a strange thing to do, but it was like there was so much people, you know, by that time there had been a lot of people thinking about lasers for stopping GI bleeding. We'd already been down there with it, so not the way to go. It doesn't work. It causes full thickness injury part of the time. You can actually erode a hole all the way through the stomach wall. I got this thing called the fast pulse thermal cautery probe that will beat the socks off a laser every time. Nonetheless, a lot of the GI public was still like, oh, laser, that's really cool stuff, you know. We like laser, that's techie, we like that. And the endoscope companies, you know, they were kind of not getting it either. They weren't getting the message either. Look, guys, I'm a physicist. I got a PhD in laser physics. Believe me, it's not the way to go. Use this device, it's much better. But still not getting traction. Then Dean Jensen, in about 1983, he decides to put on this big national course on various modalities for stopping bleeding. He had the laser companies involved. He invited me to come down with my heater probe, and he had 22 barking dogs, all set up, open stomachs, using basically our ulcer, things similar to our ulcer model to test all the modalities. At that time, he had one of his former fellows, Jim Johnson, who had now gone into private practice, who had bought one of these lasers that was supposed to stop massive GI bleeding. He came to this course as well. And he was actually kind of one of the proctors for all these other doctors that had grouped in from around the country. Imagine the effort. And this was at the Center for Ulcer Disease, or Center for Ulcer Research and so on at UCLA. It's called CURE. And so this was all at the Wadsworth VA, as I recall. And so there's all these guys sitting around with open dog stomachs and bleeding all over the place, and all these frisky endoscopists, and they're hearing all this blah, blah, blah about lasers. And I'm there, my little heater probe device, you know. And Jim Johnson, who was this guy that had been a fellow of Dean Jensen at UCLA, who had gone into private practice in Jackson, Mississippi, was there as well. And he was one of the guys that was one of the biggest voices for how good this laser was. And so I thought, this is my moment. I said, Jim, I want to show you something. You see, you got that laser right there? I want you to hit this mesenteric vessel in the dog's stomach with that laser. And he says, well, if I fire the laser at that mesenteric vessel, it's going to start bleeding. I said, wait a minute. I thought you had a hemostatic device, not a blood maker. Well, yeah, but that's pretty exceptional to, you know, shoot it right at a nice plump mesenteric artery. I said, go ahead, shoot it. So he shoots that laser at that mesenteric artery, Sure enough, blood all over the place. I take the heater probe over and I go, done. He looks at that and he's like, whew, let me have that. So for about the next hour, he was inseparable from that product. He goes back to Jackson, Mississippi. He says, I got to have one of those devices. And so I sold him one. I think it was $4,000. And so he got it in Jackson. And he was servicing 2 hospitals at that time in Jackson that were having emergent GI bleeding. And all of a sudden, he was carrying this thing from hospital back and forth. He said, I got to have a second one. I got to have one in each hospital. So pretty soon he's all over it. This thing is like, I can't believe how good this thing is. He makes, talk about free marketing, he makes a movie showing how this thing could be used to stop massive GI bleeding in actual patients. Makes that movie, wins first prize in a medical movie competition. I'm getting all this free advertising. It's great. Still don't have a company that's going to sign up. So back to Detroit. By this time, I'm so enthralled with how good this product is. I'm presenting at a laser. The enemy is out there. I'm talking to him. Reinhold Wappler, American Cystoscope Company, comes up to me after my talk. He says, David, I want you to develop a bipolar radio frequency catheter for endoscopic control of bleeding. I said, well, Reinhold, we got this great product at the University of Washington, just license that. He said, no, I don't want that. I want you to develop something specific for us that's radio frequency bipolar. And I said, well, Reinhold, we've already tested that in the laboratory. It stinks. It doesn't work. And what we had tested was a product that came out of Meditech, which was the predecessor company for Boston Scientific, and had been developed by John Abley. Well, it was a kind of a goofy little bipolar device. The physics were all wrong, and it didn't provide good tamponade. Well, I was at that time a professor, not making a lot of money in electrical engineering. I was a full professor, but still not making much money. And so he says, well, David, I'll hire you as a consultant. Just do it for us. I said, okay. And we structured a consulting agreement, and I was able to get one of my students involved and one of my technicians involved. And I sketched out exactly what I wanted by way of a radio frequency bipolar coagulator. And what I had done was I had basically copied the bullet shape of the heater probe. It was on about a 3mm catheter. And then I put an array of 6 electrodes that were interspersed bipolar radio frequency electricity on the end of that probe. And then we did like we always do. We tested it on liver. We like nice bloody red liver, and you can coagulate the liver with the device. And you can tell by the way that the heat makes the liver go to a white color. You can tell by that dispersion of the whiteness and the coagulum in the depth of the liver just by slicing through it with a scalpel. You could kind of get an idea of the heat profile, and we could test to see how fast it was and how good a job it was doing, and one thing and the other. So a student named Eric Opie and a technician named Dale Lawrence made the thing in the lab, and I took it out for a piece of liver and put it on, and I went, whew, this thing really works. It was about as good as a heater probe. Holy smokes, now we got 2 devices that do this thing. So I tell Reinhold we're going to have to do a series of dogs and stuff, and then he agreed to support a whole bunch of studies with dogs in the GI department. So the same group of people that were doing the heater probe in GI started working on this device. It was a multi-electrode hexapolar radio frequency bipolar coagulator that was endoscopically passable. So it had the good features again: low thermal mass, rapid response time, fast up, fast down, low thermal inertia, and it was bipolar the way Reinhold wanted it, was radio frequency, and the darn thing really worked. And we did a whole bunch of dogs, published a whole bunch of papers, and now we had 2 devices out there. Well, ACMI gets a whole, this was a bonanza for them. And right away they start selling this thing. And it creates a huge buzz. And now there's this new device out there that's this direct contact, very, very effective and safe, no full thickness injury. And it's changing the whole world of endoscopic control of bleeding. Aha! Now the endoscope companies are getting interested. Well, I should say one company in particular, Olympus Corporation, which was the gorilla in endoscopy anyway. They said, we're interested in acquiring this technology from the University of Washington. So I traveled out to Lake Success, Long Island, New York, to talk about this device and discussing terms and whatnot. And so finally, Olympus said, we will license the technology. So then at that time, I had to get Squibb out of the picture, bring the university back into the picture, and we had a three-way agreement between Squibb, University of Washington, and Olympus Corporation Japan to license this product and sell it. I remember we were in Long Island talking about the early sales projections. You know what? We were off by about a factor of 4 on the downside. It wound up being about 4 times more successful in the marketplace than what we had projected. It was a huge success. So we had 2 products in the marketplace that were doing the same thing. Endoscopically controlling GI bleeding, effective, shallow injury, and safe, and there they were. But if I hadn't had the second product, I might not have gotten Olympus interested in the first product. So it's funny how these things bounce off each other back and forth. At the time, I was like, I couldn't believe we had all this struggle with lasers. We couldn't make the darn thing work. All of a sudden, we got these 2 inexpensive products that are tons better than the laser. And how do you like that? So there's the story of a long history of development, all of a sudden winding up with 2 products. Because one was supported by a commercial outside entity, it got to the marketplace right away because they asked for it to begin with. And so as soon as we gave them the product, like, oh, we're going to run with this thing. And then we get the gorilla in Japan, Olympus Corporation, to license the other technology. I remember the head of research for Olympus came, and 3 of his lieutenants came all the way from Japan to Bellevue, Washington, to learn how to build these things. And we spent quite a bit of time teaching them how to build the device and the whole thing. Gave them a complete download of the technology, which Avalanche Diode to use, and the whole thing. And once they got it back to Japan, they made a beautiful product. Well, that's kind of the story could go on for hours. I mean, it's a long trajectory of invention, development, patenting, proving it clinically, and eventually getting it for sale in the marketplace. I'm just about exactly 45 minutes into the hour, and I think I'm supposed to, according to my dear friend Nicole, now open it up for questions for the rest of the hour. So here we go.
Questions, aspiring inventors, entrepreneurs in the audience. I know we have one entrepreneur who's interested in cardiovascular patents.
Yeah, I really appreciated your talk, and my name's Ben Starnes. I'm a vascular surgeon. And I think one of the things that we run into today is difficulty with conflicts of interest.
Oh boy, there's another hot button.
Yeah.
Especially in this university.
If you could speak to that. I mean, how do you manage that conflict of interest in terms of personal gain versus innovation?
Boy, that is, if you know the answer to that, tell me, because it's something I've been involved with all along, you know, and you know, most of my my business life has been wrapped up in cardiology, and so I was constantly dealing with cardiologists who, you know, I would say more than half of them were well, maybe going back to the 1980s, maybe not quite half, but certainly a lot of them wanted to know what was in it for them. They wanted some kind of a piece of the action. They wanted stock in my company, or they wanted generous consulting fees, or one thing or the other. But then, you know, so now if they've got if they own a stock in your company and they're using this device in patients, they're sitting there like with a big target on their back for a new lawyer. If there's anything ever goes wrong with their patients, say, well, you use that product just because you got stock in the company. You didn't need to use that product. And you know how lawyers will do that. And I had one famous cardiologist in Washington, D.C., Gus Pichard, and he says, I am sick of this conflict. I'm going to sell all my stock in your company, which at that time was Heart Technology. I'm going to sell all my stock so I don't have to worry about it anymore. And he continued to be a big user of our product, but he just got himself out of the picture altogether. There's no question if you own stock in a company that you're always going to be painted as a person who can't make an objective decision, you know. But that's only one part of the conflict of interest thing. And people like me who are always needing to have luminary medical people testing and advising me on product development, I'm always dealing. I'm dealing right now with a professor in Berlin who wants a big fat consulting contract. He claims I'm only interested in the science, but by the way, can we get that contract done? You know, yeah, I mean, they want a piece of the action, and they know they see people in industry who make many millions of dollars on things, and they say I deserve to get a piece of that, you know, and so there's always that edginess there about, well, I really want some financial stake here, but on the other hand, I want to be able to use it on my patients. And more, we as a person that's heavily involved in the medical device industry, we're very reluctant to even though it's the easiest thing in the world for us to give guys stock and money. I mean, it's not we're cheap or anything like that, but we're worried that it's going to come back to haunt us. Now, to give you an example of how it can haunt you, let's see, it was about 1994. The guy that was then a congressman in Oregon, who's now the senator down there, what's his name? The guy that's very active in the news, the media. It's one of those very visible senators at the national scene. When he was a congressman from Oregon in about 1994, we began getting wind of the fact that he was going to try to rescind our FDA approval, which came in 1993, for the coronary use of my product, because he said that one of the biggest contributors to the clinical trial database was a guy that had a big stock position in the company, and that was all true. So we went back, looked at the records, found out whether his contribution to the clinical trial was any different than everybody else's. So I took his 14%, compared it to everybody else. It was essentially identical. I mean, he was getting the same results as everybody else who didn't have big stock positions. I traveled with my lawyer to Washington, D.C. I met with the senator, whatever his name is, can't remember anymore. Huh? No, it wasn't. No, it was a senator from, now he's a senator from Oregon, yeah.
Senator from Oregon right now.
Yeah.
He's not Rob Wyden, is it?
Huh?
No, he's not Bob Wyden.
Ron Wyden, that's it. Well, I found out it was really one of his staff people who had concocted this whole story. You know, they always like to generate newsworthy stuff like, we're going to protect the public, and here's this dirty guy up in Redmond, Washington, who runs this company called Heart Technology. He's got this cardiologist in San Diego who contributes 14% of the cases, has a big stock position, and we're going to show how we're going to protect the public and not let them be get away with this stuff. So I went down to Wyden's office, and by that time my CV had gotten to be pretty fat, and I began to become. Oh, I got our representative from Redmond, who's now ours, Maria Cantwell. I got Maria Cantwell involved. She was our representative from Redmond, so I was in her district. Told her what was going on, and she said, "Well, keep me apprised of what's going on." So I met with Wyden and his associates. It became pretty clear that Wyden didn't even really know what the details of the case were, but he had this associate who was trying to gin up positive buzz for his boss. Put that CV on the desk. I said, you know something, Senator, or at that time Representative, I'm one of the good guys here. I've been doing research in the world of medicine. I'm doing really good stuff. I make stuff that helps people. And this is ridiculous. And furthermore, the data shows that this was not biased by the guy who had a big stock position. Well, it became pretty clear that Wyden was kind of getting embarrassed because this lieutenant that he had was concocting this whole story that didn't have any foundation. Right away, after we met with him, I went down and talked to Maria, and I told him, well, we met, and this is what we talked about, and so on and so forth. You know what? Never heard a peep out of that guy again. That was it. But they look for opportunities to show conflict of interest. And that's why there's just no magic solution. But transparency is the one thing you got. you tell the whole world, yeah, I got this position, or I don't have this position, at least they can't say you were hiding the facts. And if you tell your patients that, you know, up front, well, you know, the fact of the matter is I am a consultant for this company, and you need to know that. And if you don't want me to be your doctor, that's fine. Or if you don't want me to use this technology on you, that's fine, although I think it's the best technology out there. You got to know about it. No magic answer. It's one of the biggest problems we have in trying to combine good, hard physical science with good, hard clinical analysis and evaluation, because we have to involve the clinical side. And a lot of people say, you know, I don't make a lot of money as a doctor, and I want to have a piece of the action, or I think I should be compensated for my time. And there seems to be now an acceptance of the fact that they can take consulting monies up to a certain level, no stock position, and it's not a conflict of interest when they're involved with some particular technology. That seems to be the consensus that's formed. Yeah.
That was a great talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, as has happened many times, you sort of alluded to it, why did you decide to leave the university position you held? Is there anything the university could have done differently that would have kept you as still a senior professor at the University of Washington?
Okay. Well, this has a little bit longer answer than maybe you want, but maybe it's worth going ahead and giving you the full story. When we had this NIH contract to develop endoscopic instruments, I was a co-principal investigator with Fred Silverstein, who was an assistant professor in medicine, along with Cyrus Reuben. And so Fred, as an assistant professor of medicine, was taking money out of this contract, as I recall, or at least somewhere along the line I found what his salary was. Turned out his salary as an assistant professor in medicine was almost exactly double what my salary as a full professor of electrical engineering was. So one assistant professor of medicine equals roughly 2 full professors in electrical engineering. Yeah. Well, you know, electrical engineering is not exactly a pushover field, you know, and I'm a full professor with tenure, and he's an assistant professor. I mean, we're both great guys, and I would tell the university, I said, you know, this is not fair. Yeah, this is not fair. University said, David, we love you. We give you about all the money we can give you, but this is what the market requires. So I started building up resentment over time about this whole thing. I was tired of hearing about that's what the market requires. So, but then along about 1981, I invented this device for cleaning calcified plaque out of arteries. And I actually did it in my basement at home. And I thought, you know, this thing is so damn good because it will absolutely clean calcified plaque like gangbusters, but it'll bounce off a healthy arterial wall, have differential cutting. And I really think this could be the makings of a good business. So I went around trying to raise money to support this thing as a company. And I was going to, you know, obviously I would leave the university if I got the money. Couldn't get anybody to buy it. Finally, I met with the chairman, CEO, and president of Squibb Corporation, who happened to be in town checking up on ATL, this acquisition that they had. And Fred Silverstein at that time was working for ATL. He had left the university a year earlier. And so Fred says to me, he says, why don't you go over and talk to this guy? I said, well, if they're willing to sign a non-disclosure form, I'll do this thing. So I went over, I presented my technology, I demonstrated how it could go up and down a vessel in a cow's heart, how it worked and everything. And it turned out that the head research guy at Squibb Corporation, Charlie Sanders, was there also. And he had been a former catheter-based cardiologist at Harvard. In fact, he was the dean of medicine at Harvard before he left to go to Squibb Corporation. He saw that demonstration and he made some comment to Fred and me like, I think that's about the best presentation I've seen in 5 years. We will support this technology, but you will have to leave the university. So I took a leave of absence from the university. Squibb bought the technology. I went there full time. And that's how we also got the support for the heater probe, okay? So that's how I left the university. And I'm still an affiliate professor in bioengineering. After 3 years of leave of absence as a full professor in electrical engineering, I told the university, I think, in fairness, I've got to tell you, I'm going to have to resign my tenure. I don't see me coming back to the university, and it's kind of silly for me to pretend like I am. And then the university came back to me and said, well, why don't you become an affiliate professor in bioengineering? I said, that's fine, we'll do that. So that's how I left the university.
They have been more flexible in their options, would have avoided your need to leave?
It wouldn't have avoided the need to leave from the standpoint of developing the product. How could I ever develop a product like that in the university? You know, how could you do it? And, you know, this becomes a big deal when you have to start manufacturing thousands of these things for clinical trials and everything. It just doesn't work in a university. You really have to, it has to be a full-blown business operation. We eventually had 500 employees at Heart Technology. So, you know, you can only go so far within the university confines. Now, if the university had been much more flexible in those days and said I could be very actively involved in a company on the outside world and still be a full-time professor, that might have worked. But you know what the problem with that is? Find me a company that will take a professor's idea and really run with it. And this brings back, you know, again, we could go on for hours on this subject, but it brings back one of my favorite comments, and that is, if you want a disruptive technology to succeed, it's going to have a product champion. Champion, underline 3 times, champion. This is the person that is going to have to come back after all kinds of things go wrong and keep coming back and saying, I'm not going to let this product die, I'm not going to let this product die, I'm not going to let this product die. It was 12 years from my invention of the rotoblader until I got FDA approval in 1993, 81 to 93. I'm constantly raising money, telling people it's going to be a success. Give me some more money. It's going to be a success. Ultimately, people made a lot of money, but that takes a lot of dedication for a long period of time, and somebody has to be there when the Ron Wydens of the world come out of the woodwork and say, your data's corrupted, you know, and you got to be able to fight, fight, fight. Could you do that as a full-time professor? It's hard to imagine doing that. Could you find a businessman that would take it on with the level of heart and passion that an inventor would have? No. They won't do it. Texas Instruments Corporation did a study about 25 years ago, and they looked at something like 50 products that had been successful. And the one very strong statistical correlation that those 50 products that were successful, whether they were done within TI or done outside of Texas Instruments, the one identifiable correlate in that whole thing was there was a product champion who would not let it die, and he was going to drive it home no matter what. That's something I don't think you can have a full-time professor doing that. We've had plenty of full-time professors who have defended an article of scientific finding. We all know about them. They're all over the place. We've got Nobel Prize winners here. And they're a champion for what they've done scientifically. And that's absolutely important. And a lot of times, you know, when a new theory comes out, there are more critics coming out of the woodwork than you shake a stick at. But this person has to stick to his guns and say, no, I've done this work. It's real. And that's what it takes, that kind of passion, drive, intestinal fortitude to make it happen.
Can I ask one more question?
Of course.
So, on the same topic that Ben started, and then I think Ron continued, can you just give us 2 or 3 words about the topic of how close the university as an institution, now, I'm looking at it from the perspective of the institution, not from the person, the professor. It seems to me that over the last decade, certainly, many universities have separated themselves from industry purposely, not to be seen as the drivers of cost, not to be seen as you know, favoring somebody. And we have lost, we used to have a relationship much along the lines of what you were describing, you know, you pay fees for consultations, etc. But we used to have a much closer relationship where we could test products, where people that were interested in just moving the field forward could work. And now that has been severed by lots of regulations, because I think that philosophically the universities and industry, or many universities, have separated themselves from industry. Do you see that as true? Do you see that as
It seems like it goes in and out like the tide at the University of Washington. Now, I've been a visiting professor at Stanford. I'm very well acquainted with with Paul Yock, who runs their Center for Biodesign down there. Stanford has been one of the universities that's been held up time and time again as being a place that has managed to get the right relationship with industry. But they've had their issues too. John Simpson, who was one of the most famous cardiologists of the 20th century, eventually left Stanford because he got fed up with all the stuff that's going on, and he went to an outside hospital. I think it was Redwood City Hospital, and did his stuff there, so he didn't have to worry about the university telling him what to do. And that's Stanford. I mean, and they're supposed to be the icon of industrial relations, and obviously the tremendous amount of, well, Silicon Valley wouldn't be there without Stanford and Frederick Terman. I mean, that's all there is to it, going back to the 30s and Hewlett and Packard. And yet the university is a spawning ground for all this stuff. And we just got to constantly figure out the best way to manage it. But it's going to be a disgrace if we just say, university, I'm in an ivory tower, I'm not going to talk about anything that could possibly be built for people's use, I'm not going to do that. And when it's all ready, when it's all ready and it's on the shelf and I can buy it, I'll buy it. That's no good. There's just too much genius in the university, too much genius in the medical school, not to have that as part of the process of evolving ever better technology. And we got to adjust these things. I think transparency is a big factor. An educated public has to be a big factor. The plaintiff's bar has got to be shut down. One of my biggest regrets of Obamacare was that there was no tort reform in it. I'm mad as heck about that. Because it's screwing up so much of our civilization, not just in medicine. And for some reason in this country, we still let the lawyers run hog wild and do what they want. And they really contort the economics, and they need to be put in. There's no shame in the legal profession. That's part of the problem. There's just no shame. They'll take the most ridiculous lawsuits on where anybody looking at the facts would say this is silly. But because they got the judges on their side many times, things get wacky. But again, people like yourself have to speak out and provide examples of how, if you don't have that collaboration of medical school and professors and on and on and on, we're not going to have this continuum of great technology. Look how the world is upside down in medicine today from what it was 50 years ago. We do so much stuff, well, all the stuff we're doing now with structural heart disease, with catheters. It's spectacular stuff. And it's only going to get better and better and better. But we got to get more common sense. And we got to take on the lawyers and the FDA and everybody else in constructive conversation and point out things that are just ridiculous. And say that's just not so, and I'm going to give you example after example after example, which wouldn't have happened if we followed your directives. But I can't give you a silver bullet, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Auth. The original purpose of this lectureship really was to inspire the residents and the medical students in our department to think creatively and to hear about how people's careers have developed. And I think that you have really offered something to many of the people who I know are sitting in the back of the room, most of whom are on the floor, who have creative ideas. And I think that it's important for you all to know, with a little fortitude and maybe a little luck.
Luck is big.
Luck is big. And some coincidences, that you need to stick with it, and you need to, as Dr. Auth said, be a champion for your idea. So thank you for a very inspiring talk. We have for you a Burn Center plaque and an obligatory certificate.
Oh, great. Thank you very much.
We want to thank you very much for sharing your experience with us this morning.